If you have said to yourself, I should write that, or if someone has said to you, you should write that, then I'm talking to you because you need to write. And that's why you're tuned in to Why Write. Welcome to Why Write. I'm your host, Angela Grout, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Why Write, where we learn why writers are writing their stories and why they write might help you to start writing your story too. Today, I have a guest that is here from Virginia. Well, she's not here in the studio, as you can see. We are doing a Zoom recording, which is one of the few benefits I think we've received from the pandemic, that I can have guests on the show that don't actually have to come into the studio. So as you can see, my guest here, this is Louise Stowe-Johns, and she is a writer and a pastor and a spiritual counselor. She's been a prison chaplain, and she was the founder and director of the Victims Offender Reconciliation Program in Alabama. She is the author of a few books, including Climbing Jacob's Ladder, The 12 Steps on Your Spiritual Journey, which of course we're all on a spiritual journey. She is also the author of Redemption of a Murderer, The Life of Judy Neeley. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because this story fascinates me in many ways. Now, Louise Stowe-Johns has also written many sermons, and she's contributed to annual devotionals. She's very passionate about restorative justice, criminal justice reform, and gender equality, along with individual spiritual growth. And we have her here joining us in two locations, not sure why, but I see you on the screen both. This is my friend and fellow International Writers Guild member, sister, Louise Stowe-Johns, and we met during a playwriting class at the International Women's Writers Conference a few years ago, and we have stayed in contact. And I just want to say welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see you sort of in person.
Yes. I know we were in person when we were at the writers conference, and it was there that we met. We were both doing a playwriting class, and it's something that, I've been passionate about, writing some plays and musicals, but you were taking that workshop for another reason, and you were getting a voice of a character. Can you tell me a little bit about why you decided to take that class and what it did for you?
I enjoy drama, and of course,
oh, time. I'm just going to ask, do you have a recording in the background or something? Because there's a little echo.
No, okay,
it's fine now.
Okay,
okay, little technical difficulty, but I think our audience understands. So you were writing like a monologue.
Yes, and first and most important for our discussion today was my chance to meet you at that the Women's Guild conference, and yeah, it was good to be able to try to write something that you knew somebody else was going to be reading. It was in my voice in terms of what I wrote, but somebody else was going to pick it up and read it. So I enjoy drama, I enjoy the stage, so it was a fun time to be able to put something into writing that I really didn't expect to be using, but that's what came to me.
Yeah, and I found taking writers classes where you're doing monologues from a character actually allows that character's voice to come clear. And when someone else is reading it, like the actress, you're like, oh, now you're hearing the story was created sort of in your head, but at the same time, it's from that voice, which is really helpful in developing a story. And at the time you were finishing up this wonderful, I'm going to call it a story, but it's much more than that, Redemption of a Murderer. And, I will share what I know of it, and I'll let you fill in, but I know you were a pastor and a spiritual advisor at a jail. You were the prison chaplain, and you came across a woman named Judy Neeley. And, you have this gift, I guess, to tell her story. And it's interesting that you're telling the story of a woman who is convicted of murder.
Yes, and I was chaplain for 6 years and decided that I could not do some of the restorative justice work that I wanted to do while I was a chaplain. So I did resign, and a few years later, Judy Neeley, the woman who was on death row, whom of course I had met when I was the chaplain, she contacted me and said, would I be a spiritual counselor? And of course, I was willing to do that. So she was, over time, she trusted me enough to tell her story, and I listened as well as I could. And, it just sort of emerged that one of the things she wanted people to understand was what can happen in a domestic abuse situation and how you can come under the control of someone else to the extent that that person really, if that person tells you to do something, you will do something, from the simplest thing like take a shower to eat or don't eat or whatever. And she was totally under the control of her husband, who was 11 years older than she.
Yeah, and we tend to, I think society, we don't want to have murderers in society, but then to understand like the mind of a murderer and what causes someone to become a murderer. And like you're saying, in Judy Neeley's, specific case, I mean, she, was under a domestic abuse situation where, she was kind of ordered to become a murderer and didn't find her way out. Now, I know that, you've been a pastor chaplain in prisons for many people on death row, correct?
Not at that time, there were two. Before I left, I think there were four. Fortunately, the death row in the women's prison, it's never, I don't think, been more than six, which is six too many.
Yeah.
But like a men's death row, where there are multiple cases there. Although
Yeah, I mean, did you find that a lot, the women that you were counseling, were they at amends with their crime to be able to go to death row, to go to this electric chair or whatever, and die for their crime?
I'm sorry, were they what for the crime?
They were put to death for their crime. So as a spiritual counselor, are you bringing them to the resolution of like why they're getting this sentence? Do they have so much remorse and repentance when they're going?
It depends. In general, yeah. Interestingly, I don't want to be real specific about this information, but probably around three of the people who were on death row were there because some aspect of domestic violence. And too often women in prison are dealing with the fact that, they have been under the control of someone else. Judy was threatened if she didn't do what he wanted her to do, that she could be killed, but probably what got her even more, what was more terrifying to her, that her children could be killed, because by that time they had twins, and the twins weren't even quite 2 years old. That plus the fact that he knew where her family was. He purposely kept them apart, but he knew where they were, and he threatened to kill every one of them. She had seen his brutality and didn't question for a moment that he would do that. So she complied.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a murder mystery, April Rain, which, I have a character who, is caught in the act of kind of committing this crime, but she's doing it because she's in this domestic relationship that if she doesn't listen to what he says, and he's a police officer, and of course she's having an affair with a police officer, and he, is saying to her, if you don't do this, then, you're going to be found next to the other dead body. So, when you have that threat to yourself, and, in this book, she does have a child that is being threatened also. I mean, you try to do what's going to save your own life and save your children's life. But however, in Judy Neeley's case, I mean, here she did take other people's lives. And, you met Judy on death row, and, you're hearing her story. What called you to say, I need to tell her story? Because the women who have, domestic violence issues and who are in these relationships that are causing them to make decisions out of their control, what was your calling to say, I think I can write a story about this?
I've always enjoyed writing things, but even more importantly in some ways is my concern for people who are who have prejudice against people, prejudice against them, whose situation is such that they are victims. And I have just always cared about people who are not represented. So that made it not easy, but at least I could identify, or at least I could empathize with people whose situation, Judy was first a victim and then she was an offender. And, I don't think that's really usual. So it was a combination of concern about how she was being perceived, and having another part of the story too is the victims movement really came to the fore in the 70s and the 80s. And for centuries, the spotlight had been on the offender, and if the victim could be sort of pushed to the sideline, then the movement began, appropriately enough, to say that victims need to have their voices heard as well. And so in this, it's a balancing act of trying to respect the family members of victims or the victim themselves, while acknowledging that Judy has a story as well. The offender has a story, and how she got to the thing committing a murder. In fact, it was two murders, but she was in prison for the one in Alabama. How she got there, and that is important for people to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I've read the book. I highly recommend people to read the book, but I can see, the steps of just, bad decisions, but also looking to be loved by someone and to get into a relationship. And she gets into this relationship with this, terrible man, who doesn't treat her very well, but it's all she has. And, the steps that, he's doing as a criminal, not just to society, but to her. And, when you were sitting down talking to her, I mean, obviously she's sharing these stories with you. You're in the prison meeting room. And are you writing these things down? Is she verbally telling you? How do you, as like a sort of, writer, get this information?
One of the caveats of going into a prison, nothing in, nothing out. And so you have to be careful about what you have. I mean, you don't take in your key. Sometimes they say, maybe you don't need your glasses, no pen, no pencil. And after a year or so, I realized that there was no way I could do justice to her story, remember it accurately, if I didn't have some way of being able to record that. So I asked for permission, and thankfully, I got permission to take in my laptop. So we would sit on her bed in her cell, and she would, share with me, and I would take down, I'm not a stenographer, but I would, get it down as quickly as I could. Looking back, some of them are just totally incoherent, but it's enough that I was able to recall, some of the things or what she shared with me. So that was extremely important. And then over the years, we moved from Alabama after about 5 years after starting to work with her as a spiritual counselor. And after that, it was much more phone calls and letters. I take notes still when I'm talking with her on the phone. And we talk maybe
You
once.
still have contact with her today?
Yes, I do. That's continued. It's been 42 years, 40 years for me. Yeah.
40 years. Wow. So that's an incredible gift for her on death row to have a friendship with someone like you. Also, kudos to your career because that's a huge calling and undertaking to take. And, to be a spiritual director for anyone is a gift, but especially for someone who's on death row. And with Judy Neeley, what I found fascinating about the story is, of course, you have the redemption of a murderer. She's obviously completely regretful of what happened. She also explains how she got in the situation for it to happen, but she also wanted to get like her sentence reduced and not, be put to death. And how much did your book, your story, or even her story help with that? And, I don't want to give too much away of the book, but it's really fascinating about how you think, if someone's going to apply for, mercy and, what that will bring.
And about 17 years after she had been on death row, her appeals were running out. And there were folks that were trying to encourage her, persuade her to apply for clemency. She was ambivalent about that in many ways. I won't try to go into all the reasons for that, but she was not really excited about that because she'd been preparing herself to die for so long, and she really just wanted to be free of, all of the guilt that she felt, and not free in the sense of, I didn't do it, not to take one, I'm not taking responsibility, but it was so heavy on her. But also, the kind of thing where you think if you die, that everybody else's life will be better. And that's what she felt. So the idea of applying for clemency was not high on her agenda. Uh, a group did come together and gave a plea to the governor. And amazingly, really, chances very, very, very small, he did grant clemency. So she's remained in prison, but the chances of getting out, I would say, are not great, just because there are people who refuse to leave, changed, and I've seen her change. I know she would not be a threat to society, but if you don't, if you want to bring up her awful crime again, it does, send sort of shockwave. And the victim's family, understandably, don't think she ought to be let out of prison.
Right, and the Pickett family, she murdered a young girl from the Pickett family. Her husband at the time are they still married? Did they get divorced?
That not long after she went to death row, she divorced him. She just knew that, he was toxic for her. That one of the things about him is he certainly commits crime over time. No question about that. In fact, when he met her, he was somebody who had already committed crime, and he's on the police radar. But he would find his first wife and also in Judy's second wife, they would end up being the ones who committed the most egregious act, so that his hands were, of course, not clean, but he could pretend they were. So he could say, in fact, he said when she murdered the 13-year-old, they couldn't prove he was there. And she couldn't, she said he was, but there was no actual proof. So he had ways of avoiding detection, so to speak, had her do the most awful things, and then he felt he could walk away from it.
Yeah, and he's kind of ordering her to commit these murders, otherwise he's going to murder her. And at the same time, even when she's in jail, he's writing her these letters, which are still showing her as his victim, because he's still got control over her from another jail, which is kind of bizarre to see that relationship, for a little while as you're reading the pages and you're like, why is this guy even allowed to have contact with her?
Yeah, and the letters sometimes bounce between seemingly loving and, caring about her. On the other side, they're threatening. He just speaks horribly about her mother, which is, of course, quite, painful to Judy. So you get you get the dichotomy of that relationship. Judy feels, she feels still committed to him, and yet she begins to see, what kind of a person he is. But it's not until she's on death row, I was a couple of years, that she's able even to start grasping. But she was 18 at the time. Our brains are still working, getting mature.
Oh, yeah, she was a child when she met
Yeah.
him, for sure. You know, as a writer, my writer mind now is kind of kicking in, saying, okay, so you were able to tell the story using real names. Did you have to get permissions for that? Did you have to sign any, papers saying, yeah, it's okay to tell this story? I know a lot of it's in the court system, so it's available.
I tried to be I was very careful, as I could be, to, first of all, if there were characters along the way, like she called and threatened somebody, and, I had her real name, but I changed that because that one wouldn't have even known that she would be in the book. So there were people along. It was easy to change. It was a dilemma about changing the major characters, the major victims and their families, but because I knew could go online and find as much information as they wanted, so although sometimes a bit skewed. But
Yeah.
I decided with them that just so that they didn't, if they ever opened the book, they didn't see their name, blaring out at them, that there was a bit of anonymity, and maybe even they could, have a hair of objectivity. But their lives, which are the victims' families, were changed forever.
Oh, yeah. I mean, these victims, and my deepest condolences and anger for them too. Like, I'm mad that no one deserves to be murdered ever. I mean, this was a very cold-blooded crime. And for the families, it's like, yeah, you want to be able to protect them, but at the same time share their story. And here you're sharing kind of the other side of the story, because there's always two, three, many sides of the story. And we do, I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of writers, but I mean, me, like, I will write from real life experiences, taking those experiences that either I've witnessed, listened to, watched, or participated in, and use them in the story, but obviously, change the names, because either the real names aren't relevant, or the real names could be relevant. But I also don't want them to be looking, saying, oh, she wrote a story about, our family, like, with the Pickett family and the other family.
Yeah, and particularly if you're writing something that's fiction, where you certainly don't want it to be so clear that it's about that particular person in your life. So, yeah, the use of the making some of it sort of anonymous is very important. And I really did not want in the book to speak unkindly of anyone. I wanted to present the information. I would say my one exception would be her ex. Then, when you talk with people over time, you learn things, and some things shouldn't go into print. And so I want to be
Right.
very sensitive about that. I would love to know more about the 13-year-old, but I was not going to go there for a lot of reasons. And the major one is I did not want to put the family through anything.
Right.
But
Yeah, and I think the families of victims like that, they want to preserve their loved ones integrity, and it's private. That's their life. And whatever the reasons that she was in that situation, I mean, that's for them to know, because the real thing is, these people committed a heinous act. So, going back to Judy Neeley and the fact that she was given clemency, this was the part of the story that I was really kind of torn a little bit about, because it's like, you're like, oh, yes, they understand that, she wasn't the mastermind behind, these crimes, and that she was a victim. And, they're giving her clemency. They're not going to sentence her to death. But at the other hand, she is now sentenced to life in prison. And, as a taxpayer, I'm saying, well, wouldn't it have been cheaper to put her to death than to keep her alive? But at the same time, it's like, I just, I get torn in so many different directions thinking about this. And, from her perspective, I see how you're saying she was preparing to die. And all of a sudden you're like, okay, you're going to die at, 2:00 today. And then they're, not that it was 1:45 when she got the call, but 1:45, no, you're not. Now you're going to spend another 30 years in prison. And it's like, what's the gift in that sentence?
Interesting that death penalty cases from start to, I don't like to use the word, but I'll use it, finish, when somebody's executed, cost much more than somebody being in prison. I mean, I suppose it could at some point max out, but it's millions of dollars just to mount the defense, to go through all of it. And then once you're in prison, if you're on death row, the security is higher. You've got to have more officer power from time to time. If you move in prison, you've got to be probably at least two officers, if not more. It just the whole thing there. It's much more expensive to the state for a person to be on that road, and the whole process from the being charged to if the person is put to death.
Where is Judy now?
It's the same prison, Julia Prison for Women, Topeka, Alabama, and they're
And
for people being paroled. She really, I just have, she could live house. I have no question, not that we have room, but anyway, but I have no question that she would not reoffend. I mean, that's just, she is,
Yeah.
you know, she is
Well,
remorseful.
and so she was 18 years old at the time of the crime, and that was in what year?
That was in 82.
Yeah. So I mean, we're talking, over 40 years she's been in prison, for being in a terrible abusive relationship that caused her to become, a two-time murderer.
Mm.
And, taking the lives of those young girls, which is so sad that, they haven't had any kind of life. And, she's had a life behind bars, and she's also had this experience of meeting someone like you where she can prepare herself, for death, but also preparing herself, for being able to ask for clemency, even though I know that's not what she wanted, and sharing her story with you, who's put it in the bindings of a book, which is, I think, something that people definitely need to read, because it's so important to see how the justice system works, to see how, these women, I know women who, have been married to military or married to police officers, they've been abused and they don't know how to get out of the situation because they're trapped. And, Judy Neeley was not married to a police officer, someone in the military, but it was someone who had this control over her. And it's a very difficult situation for these women.
And she, at the time that she ran away with him, being just turning 15, she didn't know resources, and we're talking, the late 70s. She didn't have access to anything, anybody to help her get out of that situation. And the longer it went on, the more the smaller her cage became in that quote relationship. And then you mentioned the thing about trusting and wanting something along the lines of looking for love, thinking early on she had it, and that she was escaping difficult home situation. We know none of that is right. None of that's what panned out.
Yeah, well, I mean, you obviously have a great listening ear. You have a very kind heart, and you have a very talented hand to be able to, write so eloquently and detailed, and to share a story of, someone that, you came in encounter with to, to help, I'm going to say, reconcile her with her crime, with God, with her life. My heart does also break for her, because I do see, after reading this book, what she's been through that caused this. I mean, it doesn't bring back the lives that she took, but it definitely shows me, just where you want to try to stop someone in their tracks, and, when someone's coming from a background that's not, encouraging and healthy, you want to keep them on the right track, and it's hard to do that. And I'm grateful that she met you. I'm grateful that I met you. This book is very well written. I know you took a lot of time with this, and you definitely got her voice, as well as putting a little bit of yourself in there. How did you feel about putting yourself in there?
I wanted to be in the background, but it's a little hard when you're doing first person. So
Yeah.
I just wanted anything about me was in relationship to Judy. It was, it's a book about her. So that's what's so important to me, for people to hear about her story, because there are many other people who've gone through certainly the same thing, but very similar situation. One of the things I do mention, and this is significant to me, when she wrote to several of the victims or victim family members, she always made it clear that she didn't ask for their forgiveness. And she also didn't ask for them to intervene anyway, to contact anybody to help make her situation easier, perhaps even to say support parole. She was really very specific about that. And that's one of the indicators to me of her sincerity and her desire to make amends as much as possible.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I thank you for, sharing Judy's story with, the world, but also just for teaching us how to, talk to somebody, get their story, put it on paper, learn to get, whether it's permissions or, changing names, and really sharing a story to shed light on something that, you know, not everybody is aware of. Can you tell people where they can get this book? Where they can get more information on you?
Yeah, the Kindle version, well, it's both paperback and hardback, and through Amazon is certainly possible. Just, you know, type in my name and the name of the book, and it will come up pretty quickly. And
All
my
right.
website is www.louisestowe-johns.com. So it's
All
just
right,
my,
I will add that. I will add that into the links below. And, you know, I want to say thank you for letting me be one of your beta readers and to write a, you know, endorsement review on the book, because it was a great honor for me to do that, because here I'm writing fictional stories, but I understand the process, and learning your process has helped me understand my process better too. You know, understanding why I'm using certain scenarios and changing them around. So thank you so much for coming on the show, and I can't wait for everybody to read your book. And I wish you well. I wish peace to the families, and also to Judy Neeley.
thank you so much, Angela. My
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thank you. And thank you to you, my audience here at yWrite. I'm sure you enjoyed this episode. Every episode's a little bit different. We learn something new each time. So I hope that you'll, you know, go out and be a reader, but you'll also be a writer, because I'm sure you have a story that you want to be writing. And maybe it's not even your story. Maybe it's someone else's. So today I'm going to give you your writing prompt, as I always do. So I want you to pick up your pen, set your timer for about 10 minutes, and just kind of jot down somebody's story. Maybe your daughter has a story, your husband, your wife, your coworker. Maybe there's a story there that you think is really worth telling, and just start writing about it a little bit, because you know what? That's a story that you might have to be the writer for. So thank you for tuning into yWrite, and we will see you next time. Bye.